A Daughter of the Samurai. Chapter 2. Curly Hair. One day, the servants returned from temple service, talking excitedly about a fire at Kyoto which had destroyed the great Hongwanji. As this was the Prince Temple of Shin, the sect most popular among the masses, interest in its rebuilding was widespread and donations were being sent from every part of the empire. The Buddhist exiles of ancient times had left their impress upon Etsuko to such an extent that it soon excelled all other provinces in eagerness to give, and Nagaoka was the very centre of the enthusiasm. 1st and the 15th of each month, being workmen's holidays, were favourite times for collecting, and as our gifts were mostly of our own products, it was interesting to watch the people who thronged the streets on these days. Besides our own townsfolk, each one carrying a basket or a bundle, groups kept coming every hour of the day from the mountains and from the neighbouring villages. There were men laden with bunches of hemp and coils of rope, or with bundles of bamboo poles, the long ends trailing on the ground as they walked. Women from weaving villages weighted down with bolts of silk or cotton, and farmers pulling long carts piled high with bales of the 5 grains: rice, millet, wheat, oats, and beans, with the farmer's wife, frequently with a baby on her back, pushing at the end. All these gifts were taken into a large building put up on purpose for them, and every day the collection grew. One day, Ishi and I were standing just within our big gateway, watching the people go by. I noticed that almost every woman had her head wrapped in the blue and white towel that servants wear when dusting or working in the kitchen. "Why does everybody wear tenugui on the streets?" I asked. "Those women have cut their hair, Etsubo-sama," Ishi replied. "Are they all widows?" I asked in astonishment, for it was the custom for a widow to cut off her hair at the neck and bury half of it with her husband, the other half being kept until her own death. I thought I had never seen so many widows in my life, but I soon learned that these women had cut off most of their hair that it might be braided into a huge rope to be used in drawing the lumber for the important centre beam of the new temple. Our own servants had cut big branches from their heads, but with more moderate enthusiasm than that of the peasant class. They had retained enough to dress it so as to cover their bald crowns. One of the maids, however, in religious fervour, had cut off so much that she had to postpone her marriage for 3 years, for no girl would marry with short hair. Not a man of those days would be brave enough to risk the ill omen of taking a bride with the cut hair of a widow. Our family did not belong to the Shin sect of Buddhists, but every woman of whatever sect wanted to have a part in the holy cause, so each of us added a few strands. The hair was taken to the building where the donations were kept and braided into long, thick ropes. Then, just before the removal to Kyoto, all the gifts were dedicated with an elaborate religious ceremony. It seemed to my childish mind that almost everybody in the world came to Nagaoka that day. Most certainly the nearby country district and all the neighbouring villages had emptied themselves into the narrow streets, through which Ishi took me on the way to the temple. But at last we were stationed in a safe place, and I stood holding tight to her hand and looking up wonderingly at the great shrine of gold and black lacquer, which was placed high on an ox cart just in front of the temple entrance. The curving doors were wide open, showing the calm-faced Buddha standing with folded hands. Surrounding the base of the shrine, gradually widening and spreading above it, was a delicate framework representing the 5 coloured clouds of paradise. Many, many lotus blossoms of gold and silver, pink, purple and orange twisted through the carved clouds and seemed to float in the air. It was wondrously beautiful. The 2 oxen loaned by proud farmers for this occasion were almost covered with strips of bright-coloured silk dangling in long fluttering streamers from horns and harness. Suddenly there was a moment's hush. Then, with the returning sound of a multitude of voices, mingled the beating of gongs and the shrill piping of temple music. "Look, Etsubo-sama," said Ishi. "The sacred Buddha is starting on the tour of appreciation. It is the first time in many years that the Holy One has come forth from the temple altar. Today is a great day." As the oxen strained and pushed against the big wooden yoke, and the shrine with the gilded Buddha began to move, a low murmur of "Namu Amida Butsu," "Hail, great Buddha," breathed through the air. With deep reverence, I bowed my head, and folding my hands together, I too whispered the holy words. 2 long twisted ropes of cloth, purple and white, were fastened to the front of the broad cart and reached far past the oxen to the chanting priests in front. These ropes were held by the eager hands of many men and boys, women and girls, some with babies on their backs, and little children of all ages. I saw a playmate. "Ishi! Ishi!" I cried, so excited that I almost tore her sleeve. "There is Sadako-san holding the rope. Oh, may I walk beside her and hold the rope too? Oh, may I?" "Hush, little mistress. You must not forget to be gentle. Yes, I will walk with you. Your little hands shall help the holy Buddha." And so we walked in procession, Ishi and I. Never in my life, perhaps, shall I experience an hour more exalted than when we passed through those narrow streets behind the solemn chanting priests, my hand clasped about the pulling cord of the great swaying, creaking cart, and my heart filled with awe and reverence. The services of dedication I recall very mistily. The new building was crowded with huge pyramids of donations of every kind. The shrine was carried in and placed before a purple curtain with a big swastika crest on it. There were marching, chanting priests in gorgeous robes with crystal rosaries around their folded hands. There was the fragrance of incense, the sound of soft temple drums, and everywhere low murmurs of "Namu Amida Butsu." Only one thing in the great room stands clear in my memory. On a platform in front of the altar with the holy Buddha just above was a huge coil of jet black rope made of the hair of thousands of women. My mind went back to the day when I thought I was seeing so many widows in the street, and to our servants with their scanty hair dressed over bald crowns. And then, with a pang of humiliation, I recalled the day our own offering was sent. For beside the long, glossy, straight wisps of my sister's hair lay a shorter strand that curled into ugly, mortifying waves. Even after all these years, I felt a bit of pity for the girl who was myself when I remember how many bitter trials she had to endure because of her wavy hair. Curly hair was not admired in Japan, so although I was younger than my sisters, on hairdressing day, which came 3 times in 10 days, I was placed in the care of the hairdresser as soon as she came into the house. This was unusual, for the eldest should always be attended to first. Immediately after the shampoo, she saturated my hair with almost boiling hot tea mixed with some kind of stiffening oil. Then she pulled the hair back as tight as possible and tied it. Thus I was left while she dressed the hair of my sisters. But that time my whole head was stiff and my eyebrows pulled upwards, but my hair was straight for the time being and could easily be arranged in the 2 shining loops tied with polished cord, which was the proper style for me. From the time I can remember, I was always careful about lying quiet on my little wooden pillow at night. But by the next morning, there were sure to be little twists at my neck and a suspicious curve in the loops on the top of my head. How I envied the long straight locks of the court ladies in the roll pictures hanging in my room. One time I rebelled and used return words to my nurse, who was trying to comfort me during one of my gluing up experiences. Kind old Ishi forgave me at once, but my mother overheard and called me to her room. I was a little sullen, I remember, as I bowed and seated myself before her cushion, and she looked at me severely as she spoke. "Etsuko," she said, "do you not know that curly hair is like animal's hair? A samurai daughter should not be willing to resemble a beast." I was greatly mortified and never again complained of the discomfort of hot tea and scented oil. On the day of my 7th year celebration, I experienced a humiliation so deep that it still aches me to think of it. This celebration is a very important event in the life of a Japanese girl, as much so as her debut party is to an American young lady. All our women relatives were invited to a great feast where I, in a beautiful new gown, occupied the place of honor. My hair had been elaborately arranged, but the day was rainy, and I suppose some persistent small strands had escaped their stiff prison, for I overheard one of my aunts say, "It's a shameful waste to put a beautiful dress on Etsu. It only attracts attention to her ugly, twisty hair." How deeply a child can feel. I wanted to shrivel to nothingness inside the gown of which I had been so proud, but I looked straight ahead and did not move. The next morning when Ishi came in with some rice and looked at me, I saw the pain in her eyes and I knew that she had heard. That night, when she came to undress me, she had not removed the little blue and white towel that all Japanese servants wear over their hair when at work. I was surprised, for it is not polite to appear before a superior with the head covered, and Ishi was always courteous. I soon found out the truth. She had gone to the temple as soon as the dinner was over, and cutting off her splendid straight hair, had placed it before the shrine, praying the gods to transfer her hair to me. My good Ishi, my heart thanks her yet for her loving sacrifice. Who shall say that God did not pity the simple soul's ignorant loving effort to save from humiliation the child she loved? At any rate, her prayer was answered when in later years the hand of fate turned my steps towards a land where my curly hair no longer caused me either sorrow or shame. Chapter 3. Days of Can. We did not have kindergartens when I was a child, but long before the time when I could have been admitted to the new after the 6th birthday school, I had acquired a goodly foundation for later study of history and literature. My grandmother was a great reader, and during the shut-in evenings of the long snowy winters, we children spent much time around her firebox, listening to stories. In this way, I became familiar when very young with our mythology, with the lives of Japan's greatest historical personages, and with the outline stories of many of our best novels. Also, I learned much of the old classic dramas from grandmother's lips. My sister received the usual education for girls, but mine was planned along different lines for the reason that I was supposed to be destined for a priestess. I had been born with the navel cord looped around the neck like a priest's rosary, and it was a common superstition in those days that this was a direct command from Buddha. Both my grandmother and my mother sincerely believed this, and since in a Japanese home the ruling of the house and children is left to the women, my father silently bowed to the earnest wish of my grandmother to have me educated for a priestess. He, however, selected for my teacher a priest whom he knew, a very scholarly man who spent little time in teaching me the forms of temple worship, but instructed me most conscientiously in the doctrine of Confucius. This was considered the foundation of all literary culture and was believed by my father to be the highest moral teaching of the time. My teacher always came on the days of 3s and 7s, that is, the 3rd, 7th, 13th, 17th, 23rd and 27th. This was in accordance with our moon calendar's custom of dividing days into groups of 10s instead of 7, as is done by the sun calendar. I enjoyed my lessons very much. The stateliness of my teacher's appearance, the ceremony of his manner, and the rigid obedience required of me appealed to my dramatic instinct. Then the surroundings were most impressive to my childish mind. The room was always made ready with especial care the day of my lessons, and when I entered, invariably I saw the same sight. I close my eyes now, and all is as clear as if I had seen it but an hour ago. The room was wide and light, and was separated from the garden porch by a row of sliding paper doors, crossed with slender bars of wood. The black-bordered straw mats were cream-coloured with time, but immaculate in their dustlessness. Books and desks were there, and in the sacred alcove hung a roll picture of Confucius. Before this was a little teakwood stand from which rose a curling mist of incense. On one side sat my teacher, his flowing grey robes lying in straight, dignified lines about his folded knees, a band of gold brocade across his shoulder, and a crystal rosary around his left wrist. His face was always pale, and his deep, earnest eyes, beneath the priestly cap, looked like wells of soft velvet. He was the gentlest and the saintliest man I ever saw. Years after, he proved that a holy heart and a progressive mind can climb together, for he was excommunicated from the Orthodox temple for advocating a reform doctrine that united the beliefs of Buddhism and Christianity. Whether through accident or design, this broad-minded priest was the teacher chosen for me by my broad-minded, though conservative father. My studies were from books intended only for boys, as it was very unusual for a girl to study Chinese classics. My first lessons were from the 4 books of Confucius. These are Dayagaku, Great Learning, which teaches that the wise use of knowledge leads to virtue; Chuyo, the unchanging centre, which treats of the unalterableness of universal law; Rongo and Moshi, which consist of the autobiography, anecdotes and sayings of Confucius, gathered by his disciples. I was only 6 years old, and of course I got no one idea from this heavy reading. My mind was filled with many words in which were hidden grand thoughts, but they meant nothing to me. Sometimes I would feel curious about a half-caught idea and ask my teacher the meaning. His reply invariably was, "Meditation will untangle thoughts from words," or 100 times reading reveals the meaning. Once he said to me, "You are too young to comprehend the profoundly deep books of Confucius." This was undoubtedly true, but I loved my lessons. There was a certain rhythmic cadence in the meaningless words that was like music, and I learned readily page after page until I knew perfectly all the important passages of the 4 books and could recite them as a child rattles off the senseless jingle of a count-out game. Yet those busy hours were not wasted. In the years since, the splendid thoughts of the grand old philosopher have gradually dawned upon me, and sometimes, when a well-remembered passage has drifted into my mind, the meaning has come flashing like a sudden ray of sunshine. My priest teacher taught these books with the same reverence that he taught his religion, that is, with all thought of worldly comfort put away. During my lesson he was obliged, despite his humble wish, to sit on a thick silk cushion the servants brought him, for cushions were our chairs, and the position of instructor was too greatly revered for him to be allowed to sit on a level with his pupil. But throughout my 2-hour lesson he never moved the slightest fraction of an inch except with his hands and his lips, and I sat before him on the matting in an equally correct and unchanging position. Once I moved. It was in the midst of a lesson. For some reason I was restless and swayed my body slightly, allowing my folded knee to slip a trifle from its proper angle. The faintest shade of surprise crossed my instructor's face. Then, very quietly, he closed his book, saying gently but with a stern air, "Little miss, it is evident that your mental attitude today is not suited for study. You should retire to your room and meditate." My little heart was almost killed with shame. There was nothing I could do. I humbly bowed to the picture of Confucius and then to my teacher, and backing respectfully from the room, I slowly went to my father to report, as I always did, at the close of my lesson. Father was surprised, as the time was not yet up, and his unconscious remark, "How quickly you have done your work," was like a death knell. The memory of that moment hurts like a bruise to this very day. Since absence of bodily comfort while studying was the custom for priests and teachers, of course all lesser people grew to feel that hardship of body meant inspiration of mind. For this reason, my studies were purposely arranged so that the hardest lessons and the longest hours came during the 30 days of midwinter, which the calendar calls the coldest of the year. The 9th day is considered the most severe, so we were expected to be especially earnest in our study on that day. I well remember a certain 9th day when my sister was about 14 years old. She was preparing to be married. Therefore, the task selected for her was sewing. Mine was penmanship. In those days, penmanship was considered one of the most important studies for culture. This was not so much for its art, although it is true that practicing Japanese penmanship holds the same intense artistic fascination as does the painting of pictures. But it was believed that the highest training in mental control came from patient practice in the complicated brushstrokes of character writing. A careless or perturbed state of mind always betrays itself in the intricate shadings of ideographs, for each one requires absolute steadiness and accuracy of touch. Thus, in careful guidance of the hand, were we children taught to hold in leash the mind. With the first gleam of sunrise on this 9th day, Ishi came to wake me. It was bitterly cold. She helped me dress, then I gathered together the materials for my work, arranging the big sheets of paper in a pile on my desk, and carefully wiping every article in my ink box with a square of silk. Reverence for learning was so strong in Japan at that time that even the tools we used were considered almost sacred. I was supposed to do everything for myself on this day, but my kind Ishi hovered around me, helping in every way she could without actually doing the work herself. Finally, we went to the porch overlooking the garden. The snow was deep everywhere. I remember how the bamboo grove looked with its feathery tops so snow-laden that they were like widespread umbrellas. Once or twice a sharp crack and a great soft fluff of spurting snow against the grey sky told that a trunk had snapped under its too heavy burden. Ishi took me on her back and, pushing her feet into her snow boots, slowly waded to where I could reach the low branch of a tree, from which I lifted a handful of perfectly pure, untouched snow, just from the sky. This I melted to mix for my penmanship study. I ought to have waited to get the snow myself, but Ishi did it. Since the absence of bodily comfort meant inspiration of mind, of course I wrote in a room without a fire. Our architecture is of tropical origin, so the lack of the little brazier of glowing charcoal brought the temperature down to that of outside. Japanese picture writing is slow and careful work. I froze my fingers that morning without knowing it until I looked back and saw my good nurse softly crying as she watched my purple hand. The training of children, even of my age, was strict in those days, and neither she nor I moved until I had finished my task. Then Ishi wrapped me in a big padded kimono that had been warmed and hurried me into my grandmother's room. There I found a bowl of warm, sweet rice gruel made by my grandmother's own hands. Tucking my chilled knees beneath the soft padded quilt that covered the sunken firebox, I drank the gruel while Ishi rubbed my stiff hand with snow. Of course, the necessity of this rigid discipline was never questioned by anyone, but I think that because I was a delicate child, it sometimes caused my mother uneasiness. Once I came into the room where she and father were talking. "Honourable husband," she was saying, "I am sometimes so bold as to wonder if Etsuko's studies are not a little severe for a not too strong child." My father drew me over to his cushion and rested his hand gently on my shoulder. "We must not forget, wife," he replied, "the teaching of a samurai home. The lioness pushes her young over the cliff and watches it climb slowly back from the valley without one sign of pity, though her heart aches for the little creature. So only it can gain strength for its life's work." Because I was having the training and studies of a boy was one of the reasons why my family got into the habit of calling me Etsubo, the termination bo being used for a boy's name, as ko is for girls. But my lessons were not confined to those for a boy. I also learned all the domestic accomplishments taught my sisters: sewing, weaving, embroidery, cooking, flower arranging, and the complicated etiquette of ceremonial tea. Nevertheless, my life was not all lessons. I spent many happy hours in play. With the conventional order of old Japan, we children had certain games for each season. The warm, damp days of early spring, the twilight evenings of summer, the crisp, fragrant harvest time, or the clear, cold snowshoe days of winter. And I believed I enjoyed every game we ever played, from the simple winter evening pastime of throwing a threaded needle at a pile of rice cakes to see how many each of us could gather on her string, to the exciting memory contests with our various games of poem cards. We had boisterous games too, in which a group of all girls, of course, would gather in some large garden or on a quiet street where their houses were hemmed in behind hedges of bamboo and evergreen. Then we would race and whirl in the Fox Woman from the Mountains or Hunting for Hidden Treasure. We would shout and scream as we tottered around on stilts in the forbidden boy game of Riding the High-Stepping Bamboo Horse, or the hopping game of the One-Legged Cripples. But no outdoor play of our short summers, nor any indoor game of our long winters, was so dear to me as were stories. The servants knew numberless priest tales and odd jingles that had come down by word of mouth from past generations, and Ishi, who had the best memory and the readiest tongue of them all, possessed an unending fund of simple old legends. I don't remember ever going to sleep without stories from her untiring lips. The dignified tales of Honourable Grandmother were wonderful, and the happy hours I spent sitting with primly folded hands on the mat before her, for I never used a cushion when Grandmother was talking to me, have left lasting and beautiful memories. But with Ishi's stories, everything was different. I listened to them, all warm and comfortable, snuggled up crookedly in the soft cushions of my bed, giggling and interrupting and begging for just one more, until the unwelcome time would arrive when Ishi, laughing but stern, would reach over to my night lantern, push one wick down into the oil, straighten the other, and drop the paper panel. Then at last, surrounded by the pale soft light of the shaded room, I had to say goodnight and settle myself into the kinoji, which was the proper sleeping position for every samurai girl. Samurai daughters were taught never to lose control of mind or body, even in sleep. Boys might stretch themselves into the character dai, carelessly outspread, but girls must curve into the modest, dignified character kinoji, which means spirit of control. End of part 2. If you are enjoying these audiobooks and would like to help this channel, please take the time to like or subscribe, leave a comment, or share the information about this channel with your friends. Thank you.